Welcome to Reclaim, a podcast for women, by women, on conversations that matter. I am your host, Thais Sky, international speaker, teacher, and a certified life coach currently working to become a licensed psychotherapist in the state of California. Join me here every week as I offer thoughts and interviews on what it means to reclaim your humanness in this messy world. Hello, everybody. Thais Sky here. Welcome to Reclaim the Podcast. Woo! I've been getting great feedback from you all that you are enjoying these solo casts, these solo episodes. I'm so glad that you are enjoying them because I am enjoying doing them. In fact, as I mentioned a couple episodes ago, I feel more invigorated than ever before about Reclaim this podcast. I'm really excited for 2020. And everything that I'm going to be offering you through Reclaim the Podcast. It feels really, really good. Everything is feeling really, really good lately, to be honest. It's been feeling really, really good to being in my business, which, you know, if you're an entrepreneur, which I talked about last week, that's not always the case, and that's okay. Even if you're doing what you absolutely love to do, you are allowed to have off days. You are allowed to have off weeks, off months. Again, just because you're living your purpose or you're doing what you love doesn't mean that you have to love it every single day. And so, you know, there are weeks where being in my business feels a little bit harder than others. And this week is just one of those weeks where I'm just feeling really, really good in my business. I just got copy from my copywriter on the new Worthy Women Rise sales page that I'm putting together. If you haven't heard of Worthy Women Rise, I don't know if you've been living under a rock, but it's my signature group program. I offer it twice a year. Doors are opening for the public in about a month-ish, a little less than a month. You can get on the wait list now by going to worthywomenrise.com. You'll see my old copy. That's the copy I've written. By copy, I mean the words on the page. Everything in my business so far has really been me behind the scenes. And this year, I felt it was time to bring on the experts, to bring on people who it's their zone of genius to write sales copy. And so I brought on my dear friend, Jenna, to help me with this. And oh my gosh, the copy that she's given me so far is so good, y'all. I'm really excited to get these edited and put it up on the sales page. And I got new branding of Worthy Women Rise. I can't wait to unveil for you all. It's just really good shit. Worthy Women Rise is going through a facelift this year, but the content is not changing because the content is fucking gold. Like, it is just so zoned into like the perfect content to support you in your transformation. I just can't even handle it. Anyway, so things are really, really good over here. And as I was thinking about what I wanted to share with you all on the podcast today, I was thinking about something that I shared on my Instagram stories last week. It was inspired by a coaching call that I had with a client who was sharing with me that, you know, this idea of like, you know, these memes that you see, these advice that you get from people on the internet, that if it's not a fuck yes, it's a no, you know, that idea. Like if it's not a full fuck yes when you're making the decision, then it's a no. And she's saying that it doesn't work for her. And I shared with her that it doesn't work for me either. And I told her why it doesn't work for me. And it really resonated with her about why it doesn't work for her. You know, this idea of like, if it's not a fuck yes, it's a no, really takes for granted this idea that we are attuned to our bodies, that we are attuned to our gut, that we are attuned to our intuition. This is something that many of us are working towards. We're working towards being attuned to our gut, being attuned to our intuition. And so the idea of fuck yes or no is a way to support us in tuning in, right? If we're not practicing intuition, if we're not practicing honing in on our body and feeling into our body, then we're never going to actually get there because it's a learned skill. It's a learned skill in that I think many of us as children were inherently connected to our bodies, but through cultural conditioning, through societal programming, through parents, blah, 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 through trauma, we've kind of disconnected from our bodies. And so now it's very much something we have to learn, how to come back into our bodies. I mean, this is the entire premise pretty much of yoga. I mean, and the fact that it's so popularized in the West speaks, I think, to many things. But one of the things it speaks to is just how prolific this dissociation with our body is, and how thirsty people are to get into their bodies again and to feel grounded in their bodies again. So this idea of if it's not a fuck yes, it's a no, it's grounded in a really beautiful idea of connecting to our body and connecting to our intuition and trusting that intuition, right? Trusting that when our gut is saying something, to listen to it, to honor it. All of this is beautiful, but none of this takes trauma into consideration. And as someone who is very trauma informed and whose work revolves around supporting women unpack their trauma, particularly as it relates to their worthiness wound, but not necessarily. There's so many different layers of trauma and complex trauma. And, you know, if we're not taking, I actually believe I did a whole episode on trauma. I will put the link to that in the show notes. Actually, now that's going to drive me crazy, and I have to actually check because, yeah, I think I did, which is really great because if I remember correctly, I go in depth about how trauma works in the body, what it looks like. Let's take a look if I can find it. Boom, I did. Episode 83, What is Trauma? This is the first episode of season 3, and I answer a question on what trauma is and it's not, how it affects people differently, and how we can make sure to not pass on trauma to our children. So go check out that episode if you are curious to learn a little bit more about my perspective on trauma. But here's the thing. Trauma impedes our capacity to be in our bodies, 1, to listen to our bodily cues, 2, and to trust what our body is telling us. For example, if something bad happened to you in an alleyway, let's say, now any alley that you walk down, you probably avoid. But if you were to walk down an alley, you'd probably feel like something bad is going to happen. That doesn't mean that something bad is going to happen. It means that this is trauma response. This is PTSD, right? This is this idea that the body remembers, and the body is now communicating to you something that happened way back when, even if it was 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. This is why so many of us, when we're talking about trauma, feel like our lives have gotten smaller in a way because we're attempting to diminish all the things that activate our trauma, like walking down alleys. So if you're walking down an alley and your spidey senses come on and you're terrified and you're scared and it doesn't seem to be quite connected to where you are or what's happening, then that, tells you something. And it's usually not that something bad is going to happen to you. So it can get confusing, is what I'm saying. It can get very confusing as to, wait a minute, is this my intuition? Is this my gut? Or, is this trauma? Is this a response to trauma? For me, part of kind of what has gotten me to where I'm at, so to speak, is my desire for people pleasing. By the way, since I was on the page here, I also have a whole episode on people pleasing. It's episode 89. It's called The Truth About People Pleasing, and I answer listeners' questions on how to begin to stop the process of people pleasing. I break down the root cause of people pleasing, why it's more than just a set of behaviors, and how we can begin to reclaim our lives and needs. So you can go to episode 89 to learn more about people pleasing. But anyway, for me, this has been a particularly large narrative that has consumed my life is people pleasing. Another way to put this is being a pathological accommodator, accommodating to the extent that it literally hurts me in order to make sure that people like me. Pathological accommodation is a psychological term created by a psychoanalyst. Let me get that name for you. I don't remember it off the top of my head. Okay, here he is. His name is Brandstaff. So he wrote an article all about pathological accommodation and how it refers to ways of being that function unconsciously to preserve a needed attachment when that bond has been traumatically threatened. So it's a way that his name is Bernard Branchard. It's basically like our compulsion to comply. It's like an unconscious need to stay connected to people by completely swallowing the self and taking on other people's desires. As you can imagine, that can be really terrifying, right? It can feel really not good, this idea of pathological accommodation or people pleasing or our compulsion to comply. The sense that like we really don't have a sense of self outside of the relationship. Okay, so if you grew up to become what we now call a people pleaser, if those are the set of behaviors that make sense to you and really label who you are, the behaviors that which you participate in the world, well, then I have some news for you. That oftentimes the first yes, our first response, our initial response is to say yes. To say yes to someone's idea, to say yes to someone's desires, to say yes to someone's request. That's our initial pull. That is our fuck yes, right? Because trauma trumps intuition, always. Our first response is typically our trauma response or our conditioned response. Our first thought, I should say, more than response. Our first thought, our first compulsion is coming mostly from conditioning. It's coming mostly from our trauma. So that idea that like our first gut instinct, our fuck yes, is actually what we should be listening to may not be appropriate for you. Because if you're like me, your first initial response is always going to be like, yes, of course I'd be happy to. And then when I sit with things later, when I really let things marinate, when I really think about them, then I realize, actually, I don't want to do that. Actually, that doesn't align. Actually, that's not the best thing for me. It's not the best way that I can make a decision, is by having said yes to that. And so it's hard. It's hard when our first desires is to say yes, because we don't know what that yes is. Is that a yes from intuition, or is that a yes from our compulsion, from our desire to people please? It can get really confusing in those quick instances. And so what's imperative that I found for myself, and maybe you find this as well, is to give yourself space before making a decision. The bigger the decision, the more important it is for me to really let myself have space to decide. Anytime I've made an instantaneous decision, a spontaneous decision, I've come to later wish that I had given myself more time, because odds are I would have given a different answer. That's not to say like I regret it, right? Regret is, well, we can choose to regret things. That's fine. There's a place for that. But I don't want to make it sound like it's all bad, it's all wrong, it's not the right thing to do. I don't know if there's necessarily a right or a wrong way to make a decision. I think ultimately life shapes us, and every decision we make informs us and teaches us and guides us. I don't think that there's any bad or wrong decision that you can make. Any decision, whether it's to leave a partner, stay with a partner, take a job, to not take the job, it's all going to lead towards your greatest good, as long as you just continue to get curious and be present and ask yourself questions. So given that, let's take off some of this pressure that there's a right or wrong decision. And so if that's the case, then what's the harm in giving yourself some time to think about a decision before making it? Now, for some of you, that have a really hard time making decisions because of a fear of commitment, you may have to take this with a grain of salt. You may have to create some systems in place so that you don't stay in the middle, stay in the hem and the haw. There's nothing that is more leaky faucet in our lives than unmade decisions, right? Like there is a point where not making any decision is making a decision. And there's probably ambivalence there and some things to get curious about. So we don't want to stay in the not decisioning, right? In the unknown of the decision. We really want to be making decisions because the murky middle doesn't offer us any movement. Again, okay, so having said that, I remember reading once that a Nobel Prize winner in economics, I think, got his Nobel Prize by this fundamental belief that we will never have all of the things we need to make a decision. We'll never have all of the facts necessary to make a full decision. So if that's the case, if we can acknowledge that you're never going to fully know, and we can also acknowledge that there is no right or wrong decision and that you can always change your mind, I know, you can literally always change your mind, it's important that we make decisions. Now, the speed in which we make decisions, I think that's up to each individual in person. And for me personally, as someone who has made so many quick decisions, what has been imperative for me is to have given myself lots of space. Lots of space. Because if the first thought is conditioning, our second thought is where we have a choice. And that's where we want to land at. And we really want to breathe into what is happening here and what is it that I truly want, and see if we can tune into our intuition and land in our yes or our no and then make a decision from that place. Okay? So decisions, there's no right or wrong answer about whether it should be quick, whether it should be slow. But for those of us that do have that people-pleasing tendencies, I just want us to be keeping this in mind, that this pressure to make instantaneously quick decision may actually result in us making decisions from our trauma, from our pathological accommodation versus the fullness of who we are. And so that's something for you to be thinking about and considering as you move forward. Okay? Hope this resonates with you. I love coming to you every week. Please, 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 if this podcast resonates with you, I would love for you to share it on, I'm predominantly on Instagram. You can tag me at I am Thais Sky. I would love for you to share this episode. You can also support the podcast on Patreon by going to patreon.com/Thais Sky. For as little as $1 a month, you can really support this podcast and its sustainability. Thank you all for listening. I look forward to coming to you next week. Thank you for listening to Reclaim the Podcast. This podcast represents the opinions of Thais Sky and her guests to the show. The content of this podcast are for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended to be a substitute for professional psychological, psychiatric, or medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified mental health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition or mental disorder.